good drug education is about best practice. It must be about best practice for the developing, emerging brain. Understand best practice is in place to protect and promote brain development, child's present and future potential, best health and well-being of the child, best education outcome for the child, best behaviour and community contribution of the child, and best family connection and cohesion of the child. These are going to be in the forefront of the education process, not languishing behind as if they don't matter and simply catering to a thrill-seeking or worse, self-medicating mechanism for young people. So, harm minimisation, again, has three clear and important pillars. Demand reduction, as we've said, is first and foremost. Supply reduction, they go together in concert, important. And of course, harm reduction, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, trying to pick up the pieces of those who've already traversed into that space of drug use, and now drug use has caused them difficulty and they require assistance and or remediation and or intervention. For the first time in our history of this policy in Australia, since 1985, demand reduction is the first and foremost pillar in this particular strategy, because people are starting to realise that prevention is far better than cure, and that's the priority. But the question is, does the policy or policy interpretation lead to an exit and cessation of drug use for those already using, or does it prevent the uptake of drug use for those not using, or does it enable, empower, endorse and equip drug use? Now that's a very important question of any mechanism or interpretation that's put in play with this particular strategy and its implementation. The second question we want to ask is, does harm reduction only policy use undermine or complement the other pillars of supply reduction and demand reduction? And that's really important, because these three pillars must work together to bring about best practice. What should drug policy do? Should it reduce, remediate, or facilitate recovery from drug use? Or does the policy or its interpretation enable, equip, empower, or endorse ongoing drug use? So for example, do the following strategies lend themselves to enabling or reducing drug use? The introduction of needle exchange programs was done so to reduce the risk of bloodborne viruses from the misuse or overuse of needles. Interesting policy was a net community benefit policy. If we reduce Hep C and Hep B or HIV or AIDS, then we're saving money in the long run, even though they're still using drugs. So the drug policy interpretation is no longer about drug use, but about the effects of drug use. So drug use is now passively endorsed, but we're trying to stop other outcomes of drug use. Fascinating in itself. But what quickly emerged was that these programs were no longer needle exchanges, because drug users were not returning the syringes to pick up new ones and therefore be accountable for the use and reuse of needles. No, they weren't doing that, because, as you can imagine, a drug user who's taken their drug use and enters into an altered state, mind-controlling, altered psychotic state, or whatever state they're in, they don't care about what they do with the syringes afterwards. So they changed it from a needle exchange program to a needle distribution, needle and syringe program, that people could hand out more and more, which we'll talk about later on. But the question I want to ask you is, this facilitating the remediation, or reduction or recovery from drug use, or is it enabling or endorsing drug use? We had a story of a gentleman who went into a recovery house to get off drugs. He brought a big duffel bag with him, and when he walked into the house, this huge duffel bag was with him, and the gentleman who's running the recovery house, which is a drug-free zone, it's an abstinence-based house, said, "What's in the duffel bag?" He said, "Syringes." And he opened the bag, they counted out, and I know this gentleman personally, he counted out 3,000 unused syringes. And he said, "Why have you got so many?" He said, "Oh, they're easy to get. No one cares how many you take. There's no accountability. I just thought I might need them." Injecting rooms. Are injecting rooms going to reduce, remediate, or facilitate recovery from drug use? Or are they going to enable, equip, and empower ongoing drug use? Now, an injecting room, again, if it was the only place a person could inject drugs, the only place, it might have merit. And if that person came in and injected their drugs and they were then facilitated into a recovery mode and given the opportunity to move into recovery and helped move into a drug use exiting mechanism, this might work, but no, it doesn't. What it does is enables the drug user to bring illegal substances, still illegal, again undermining supply and demand reduction, bring it into a taxpayer-funded facility and under supervision from government staff to break the law and self-harm. But the whole idea is so, well, they may not die, and they're supposed to help them facilitate recovery. But as we've discovered from many of our interactions, that doesn't happen. There's barely even a referral. And if there's a referral, it's not uptaken because the drug user has had their hit and they've moved on. So again, if there's no exit, then these policies are not reducing drug use, they're in fact enabling it, and they're undermining both the other pillars of demand and supply reduction. What about pill testing? Again, same principle. We now say to young people, bring your illegal drug to a public festival, we'll test it and tell you whether it's the poison you bought is the poison you bought. There are no other poisons in the poison that you bought, which basically is. In other words, I've purchased MDMA, pure MDMA, and somehow because there's no other cutting agents in it, this drug is now safe. We know from all the science that MDMA is an incredibly dangerous drug, and every person that takes it is going to have a different response to it. One person may have little impact, another person can kill them. So testing the pill to make it pure MDMA may or may not save a life, but certainly what it does is gives permission for another drug-taking episode, and again, that permission model is being added to. But the question again, is this harm reduction only policy interpretation? Is it facilitating remediation, reduction, or recovery from drug use? Or is it enabling, equipping, empowering, and endorsing drug use? Clearly the latter. But what about 12-step programs in therapeutic communities? What are they doing? Well, this is at least one of them, one of the mechanisms that actually does promote the facilitation of drug use exiting enterprises. It does remediate and it does reduce drug use. Yet these facilities and these mechanisms are so rarely engaged because they do not enable the permission model to continue to grow. And when people are compelled, invited, coerced, facilitated into these drug use exiting mechanisms, then of course the normalisation messaging suffers and the consensus diminishes, which of course is contrary to the agenda of the pro-drug lobby. So again, who is controlling the language and interpretation of our national drug strategy, as good as it is? So drug user groups also shape policy. Again, I hear that. Consumer participation models have also significantly shaped the drug and alcohol sector. Since 2004, the National Drug Strategies has emphasised the need for consumer participation. Listen to that. Consumer involvement in treatment planning and policy directions has been highlighted across most of the recent policy strategies. Not a bad idea. For drug user organisations, it's about ensuring that the voice of the drug user is heard in policy processes. So again, now we have government-funded drug-using groups that are informing drug policy. Now that would be a good idea if it was informing drug policy to help exit drug use. But is that what these drug user groups are doing? Interesting that came out of the States recently, there was an academic paper that was put together about naloxone parties and the dangers of naloxone. Now, naloxone is an opiate blocker. Emergency services and now family members can use this particular drug against opioid overdoses, and it can save lives. But this product is now being used by drug dealers who facilitate drug use parties. So bring your opioids, buy your opioids from us, try experiment with opioids, do what you want, and if you by chance have a bad trip or an overdose, we'll bring you back with a naloxone injection or a naloxone hit. And these mechanisms are enabling and permitting drug use, not rescuing from drug use, because there's no pursuit of exiting drug use behaviour. It's a continuation of drug use activity. The question we here at Delgado want to ask is, the question on any policy interpretation, use or practice is, does it empower, equip our unique human agency, the capacity to live much higher than animals? Does it make us better human beings and enhance our dignity, or does it diminish our agency? Now, we believe that the current actual policy, the National Drug Strategy, is a good one. Its wording, its agenda is to protect potential life, health, productivity, well-being. It's to maximise our humanity, our dignity and our agency. That's clear. But the way it's interpreted and used and engaged is doing the contrary. Whilst current drug users are invited into drug policy evaluation spaces and are influencing drug policy interpretation and deployment, it's interesting, ex-drug users can't influence policy. Well, that seems to be what's emerging from the gatekeepers of current drug policy interpretation. Michael Botticelli, who was the drug czar for President Obama, made this statement quite interestingly, and I'm quoting here: "I do wish the recovery community was much more involved in anti-legalization efforts," when speaking particularly about cannabis. About 26 million, according to White 2012, 26 million recovering addicts in America who are drug-free for 12 months or more. 26 million people that are not using drugs anymore. But these voices are not being heard. In Australia, the ex-drug users' experience, wisdom, insight and story are often excised from the marketplace. There's a push by some in the sector to not only excise the recovering addicts from the drug prevention narrative, but also suggest that drug prevention education may even be dangerous. So again, the normalisation message can't have any consensus-busting competition. So we've got to exercise any voice from the marketplace that's going to continue to destroy or dismantle or undermine the permission message of drug normalisation. And so again, the gatekeepers in this sector are trying to keep out ex-drug users from the prevention narratives. Yet earned resiliency and lived experience about their journey in drug use is very, very important. It's brought into other life-threatening issues like suicide or mental health, and survivors of these things are often showcased and rolled out and presented to groups, and particularly young people, about what happened to them, how they got into that space and how they survived that. And that's seen as wonderful education, but to put an ex-drug addict in front of people as part of an education program, not the sole education by a long shot, but as a 5% part of it, is also being challenged right now, again by the same gatekeepers who want permission models in play. So a question we need to ask is, does the existence of drug user groups lobbying for their rights, not for treatment so much to help them exit drug use, but rather their rights for sustainable and ongoing drug use, does this influence promote permission or prohibition? Some of these drug user groups are often funded by government, and those funding comes and goes depending on who's in power. But they have incredible influence on drug policy interpretation. An article in a recent Annex update, which is one of the drug user groups' magazines, talks in a very nonchalant manner about the term best practice when it's used to blithely mention millions of taxpayers-funded syringes being unaccountably handed out, yet having 30% of injecting drug users still sharing equipment, with 16% still sharing needles. Now, this is supposed to be harm reduction, but this is harm reduction at its best in one sense. Annex, one of these often funded government groups, recently in 2017 wrote an article about the lowdown on dirty syringes. And again, I'm quoting, "Across the country there are 3,500 needle and syringe programs, NSPs, which distribute about 50 million pieces of equipment a year." Get this. But the international best practice for injecting drugs of a fresh needle for every injection is far from reality. People who inject drugs reuse syringes, share equipment like spoons, water and tourniquets, and a small proportion continue to share injecting equipment with others. A 20-year survey of Australian needle and syringe programs said since 2011, the reuse has hovered around 21 to 25%. So even though millions upon millions of pieces of apparatus being handed out, the reuse is still at about a quarter. The percentage of people who inject drugs who reported they shared their syringes with others was still hovering at around 15 to 16%. And sharing of equipment was up around 30%. So here we have it again, in a nutshell. 3,500 taxpayer-funded needle and syringe programs, distributing 50 million pieces of injecting equipment annually. And since 2011, the reuse has hovered around 23%, and around 15% of users continue to share equipment because it's part of a ritual of the drug use set and demographic. Again, here we have enabling vehicles. This video clip is based in America because it's difficult to get one in Australia, but stories that we've heard continually from people in the sector is that needles are constantly being discarded on a regular basis, and the more syringes and the more needles in play, the more they're discarded. And of course, when the needles are discarded, then people go, in the neighbourhoods go, this is bad. We need to have a place where people inject. So they set up an injecting room. Again, a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is how you set up a normalisation mechanism. You give unaccountable access to syringes and needles. People who are stoned, wasted, high, mentally incapacitated, dehumanised by these drugs, then simply discard them wherever they are because they don't have the wherewithal or the agency to continue to dispose of them correctly most of the time. And of course they're on the streets, and then we have a call for an injecting room. So do we have to have now 3,500 injecting rooms to match 3,500 needle and syringe programs? Again, if every single injection episode happened in these facilities, this might be a viable option. But at what point is recovery sought for? Well, at what point is recovery and exiting from drug use a pursuit? This is not about drug policy, this is about ongoing drug use policy. And again, the national drug strategy is undermined by a misinterpretation of the platform. This appalling healthcare logic, or lack of it, is breathtaking. It gets even more bizarre. Moral caveats of non-judgmental attitudes are foisted upon even the NSP staff, the needle and syringe program staff. But no such moral commentary can be levelled whatsoever at the person who is the self-harming, law-breaking, body-destroying, and no doubt, family-grieving drug taker. This is really concerning. It would be laughable if it wasn't so incredibly tragic. We've got all these speech codes around not labelling or stigmatising the drug user. But if someone challenges their behaviour, they are shut down, even abused as being judgmental and harsh and unkind. But there's absolutely no caveat to monitor, to adjust, to change, or to help facilitate rescue from the tyranny of this drug use. This interpretation mechanism is disturbing at its very, very best. It's disturbing. As purportedly compassionate, intelligent, dignity-pursuing human beings, is this drug use enabling program the best we can offer for those caught in addiction? Is this really the best we can do for the hapless drug user? Is this the best we can do? Is this the best our elite can conjure for the broken and self-harming? I believe we can do better. I believe we can do better, much better. And those caught in addiction cannot be left to unaccountable self-harm. The drug user, along with the community, deserve drug use exiting change agency. And the misinterpretation of the current national drug strategy by a very small minority of interpreters and manipulators is undermining the health and well-being of many in our culture. I want to leave you with a quote by a libertarian by the name of John Stuart Mill. He's often quoted by many of the pro-drug activists as a shining light of cultural illumination, of progressive thinking, that we don't want a nanny state. People should be able to live their lives the way they want, as they choose. Of course, with that ever-glowing after caveat of, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. Well, even John Stuart Mill challenged that paradigm. He said this: finally, if by his vices or follies a person does no direct harm to others, he is nevertheless, it may be said, injurious by his example and ought to be compelled to control himself, for the sake of those whom the sight or knowledge of his conduct will corrupt or mislead. And even, it will be added, if the consequences of misconduct could be confined to the vicious and thoughtless individual, ought society to abandon to their own guidance those who are manifestly unfit for it? In other words, the call for compassion from this libertarian is quite clear. And who more than the hapless drug user who's doing untold harm in the community needs that help?